It's often said that teachers are what makes or breaks education, and in the 6th grade, like most other Estonian school children, I had to start learning Russian. In the first lesson, the teacher walked in and right away there was no doubt about who the boss was. She was infamous for her very strong, very offensive personality, often calling children names based on their appearance. We had a red-haired boy in class who she kept calling Gruzi, a fatter kid she called Ponchik. Myself, aside from being made fun of over my long hair, I was also quite small at the time and sat next to a bigger kid, so she called us the Fox and Bear duo from Robin Hood. Personally, I take that as a compliment, honestly. While it is true that she was part of the reason why Russian became the most hated and scariest class for many, she actually became one of the most respected teachers amongst the students. And when it came to teaching, I can honestly say that she didn't do a bad job. Now I know for a fact that the kid who was called Ruzi wasn't too happy about it, but he will probably now never forget the Russian word for ginger. I had 2 teachers after her, and while I did notice a drop in effectiveness each time, I feel like the problems with language classes more lie in the whole system rather than in the teacher alone. Our Russian lessons were those of a typical language class, working mostly with text and workbooks, notebooks and with your classmates. Already from day one, the lessons went full steam ahead, as the goal by the end of the first year was to reach A1 proficiency in Russian. And of course we had typical classroom activities, such as reading text, writing sentences, filling out worksheets, doing textbook and conversational exercises, and a large chunk of class time was also dedicated to reviewing homework. Homework, which usually consisted of similar activities, with an addition of large focus on memorization. You had to memorize texts such as stories or poems, sometimes ones that you had to write yourself, which later you had to retell in front of the class, word for word, perfectly from memory. The most common homework though was to memorize about 8 to 15 new words, as a vocabulary test took place the following day. I use the word memorize because I'm a bit reluctant to call it learning, as unsurprisingly, you'd forget most of those words after a few weeks. Of course, we also had a lot of grammar tests. Sometimes we were even allowed to use spreadsheets which had grammar conjugations printed on them. But due to the lack of proper understanding of the language, even with the spreadsheets, many students were often unable to make grammatically correct sentences anyway. It felt like trying to construct sentences through a lot of guesswork and mathematical formulas. There was no intuition of what was natural and what wasn't. We had 3 lessons per week, so in total, studying Russian from the 6th to 12th grade might amount to about 800 class hours. That's a lot, and it's not even accounting for the homework which we had to do every single time. So in a span of 6 to 7 years of that, you'd expect one to become fluent, right? Well, as the title suggests, I am nowhere near fluent, and neither are any of the people I know that went through the same ordeal. Ignoring being extremely rusty, I'd call myself something of a lower intermediate. As planned, I would say, as the national curriculum expects you to have at least B-level proficiency in Russian by the end of high school. But how is it possible to have such disappointing results after such a long time? How can it be this inefficient? Well, let's think about what some of the main issues were. The most obvious thing is probably rote learning new words. For most people, it's just such a fucking waste of time. I remember spending hours on memorizing 15 new words at once, and sometimes I still failed the test the next day, so I had to pretty much do it again for the same words. And of course a week later, I had already forgotten most of them. Is this really time well spent? And speaking of time well spent, what does class time actually consist of? If you start paying close attention, you'll notice that a big part of it is actually just wasting time. Take for instance, reviewing homework. Now, getting your own homework reviewed can be useful, but if you have to sit through your classmates presenting their homework, which might take anywhere from 10 minutes to even the entire lesson, especially when it comes to graded storytelling or reading, it's not very productive. Sure, you can learn from others, but most of the time you won't, especially when it comes to listening. In fact, it might be actually kind of harmful, because when you only listen to people that have an accent and whose speech is riddled with mistakes, you yourself might pick up those patterns. You'd be better off listening to native conversations in your target language. When it comes to the homework itself, I don't think I even need to get into why memorizing antiquated poems or long stories is a bad use of your time. Also, when it comes to taking tests, especially vocabulary ones, they aren't particularly useful. The big grammar ones that we had usually took the entire lesson, and while they can be good practice, they're not really necessary. The main reason those tests even exist is for the school to confirm whether or not you passed the class. In reality though, such accountability through frequent benchmarking is unnecessary, People who self-study usually don't waste their time on taking imaginary tests every week. Therefore, most class time would be better spent on further reviewing those concepts by yourself, or even immersing yourself in the language to solidify and pick up those concepts naturally anyway. Schools also have a few other crutches, one of the obvious ones being that classes are meant for multiple people. The teacher has to give attention to everyone, as well as move at the pace of the class, not necessarily at your pace, whether it be faster or slower. And another big issue that we faced, perhaps the biggest one of all, was breaks or vacations. We had 4 breaks in total, 2 one-week breaks, 1 2-week break, and a 3-month-long summer vacation. Of course, when you suddenly stop learning a language for 3 months, you're obviously going to forget a lot of what you had learned, and you'll end up wasting time on learning those concepts again. So essentially, you'd have to be doing reviews or self-learning during those periods anyway, as otherwise you're breaking consistency, which is perhaps the most important thing of all when it comes to language learning. Even more important, I'd say, than whatever method you use. In general, schools try to fit language learning into the traditional classroom format, as if it were math. Now, however beautiful that may sound, acquiring languages is not quite the same as math. So how compatible even is language learning with that kind of paradigm? The way babies learn their first language is through getting thousands of hours of immersion, input, and interaction. Adults, contrary to popular belief, learn in a similar manner.
Comprehensible input, in my opinion, has been the last resort of the language teaching profession. We've tried everything else. We've tried grammar teaching, drills and exercises, computers, etc. But the only thing that seems to count is getting messages you understand, comprehensible input. Talking is not practicing. What does this mean? It means if you want to improve your Spanish, it will not help you to speak Spanish out loud in the car as you drive to work in the morning. It will not help you to go to the bathroom, close the door, and speak Spanish to the mirror. I used to think those things help. Now I think they don't. Your speaking ability would emerge gradually.
Language classes, on the other hand, focus primarily on output in a kind of bottom-up manner, in order to get students to output as early as possible. For the short term, this kind of approach can be very useful, especially if you need to output in the language as soon as possible. For example, if you just got a job in Japan and need to start talking and writing in Japanese right away. However, it is not the most efficient approach for the long term, especially if your goals are high levels of proficiency. Besides Russian, I also had English classes in school for 10 years. And even in the last year, I had many classmates who were still struggling with English, while I had already been fluent for years. And the only reason behind that was because I had thousands of hours of English immersion and they didn't. Without the experience gained from immersion, you won't be able to properly feel whether or not something looks or sounds natural. Now this is really important, because being able to tell whether or not something is natural is absolutely crucial to getting to the next level in that language.
明らかに would be correct, but 明らかに sounds slightly off.
If language learning was bodybuilding, learning grammar or vocabulary is like your workout routine, whereas immersion is like your diet. No matter how hard you go in the gym, you won't become the next Arnold if you only eat 1,500 calories. Also, have a look at this video by Bald and Bankrupt.
So my tip and how I made great progress was just deciding, that's it. I am not going to learn the grammar. I'm just going to learn vocabulary. And ever since I did that, I made rapid and fast progress, quicker progress than all my friends, quicker progress than the other people in the university courses that I did in the past. You see, I've been misunderstood 1,000 times in Russia or in Belarus. Every day I'm misunderstood. People don't know what I'm talking about. But not once in all those times has that been because of my lack of grammar. Every single time I've been misunderstood, it's been because either I didn't know the Russian word or I didn't understand the Russian word they were using. It's been a lack of vocabulary. That's what's always caused the problem. So guys, if you want to learn Russian, especially in the first year, forget grammar. Forget grammar. Drill this into your head. Vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. In learning any language, vocabulary is king.
I can honestly vouch for this myself. When I started learning Japanese, I started taking 10 new words per day on Lanky, so my Japanese vocabulary became bigger than my Russian vocabulary in only a matter of months. And it felt like I was way more fluent in Japanese than I was in Russian, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about the fact that I learned Russian in school for 6 years. Anyway, I recommend you go watch the whole video later on. Does this all mean that language classes are useless? Well, as I sort of said before, it depends on what your goals are. Language classes most certainly aren't necessary. Everything you need to become fluent way beyond what language classes can offer can be found on the internet. Language classes are just another tool which you can choose whether or not you want to utilize. If you want to and like learning in a classroom setting, then you might as well, because language classes offer more than just the learning experience. They can keep you accountable, as well as be motivational, especially if you can find like-minded classmates enthusiastic to learn your target language. And I mean, who knows, maybe you'll become good friends with someone, which down the line can change your life completely. That being said, if you're going to pay for language classes, make sure you understand what you're paying for. Personally, I wouldn't pay 500 euros for an A1 level class in Japanese, but then again, I'm somebody who prefers to self-study. I do have some interest in taking Japanese classes, not so much because I'd expect to learn something from them, but rather because I'm curious to see what it's like, as well as what the other students are like. What if you're stuck in a similar situation as I was back when I started learning Russian? Well, if I were to go back in time, this is what I would do differently. The first and most important thing, of course, would be to find motivation to learn the language. No matter what method you use, you will most likely hate the learning experience if you don't have any motivation. This is also why I didn't learn Russian during those summer vacations. I absolutely hated learning Russian and had no interest in it whatsoever. So of course, why would I torture myself during my sacred time of freedom? Language learning and motivation go hand in hand, which is why I'd like to cover that topic more in depth in a different video. The next thing, which is perhaps the most practical one, is to start using tools such as SRS and perhaps even apps such as Duolingo. I recommend using Lanky and finding or creating text to expand your vocabulary. In my case, I'd probably ask the teacher for all the words we're going to learn this year. You can also look up all the new vocabulary sections from the textbook and create cards from those. Every day, I'd recommend taking around 5 to 10 new word cards, which will take you around 30 to 60 minutes. You can make cards for everything, including grammar and conjugations, and when used properly, it's going to make your life so much easier. Because you'll constantly be doing reviews, instead of just memorizing a word once and forgetting it a week later, the knowledge will actually stick with you. The third thing I do differently goes hand in hand with the previous point, which is to learn every single day. At first, this might sound intimidating, but honestly, this is just another thing to make your life easier. It's not actually that hard either. When you use Lanky, you're supposed to do your reviews every day anyway. And this tip also synergizes with the next one, which is immersion and input. I know it's hard to immerse yourself in the language every day for hours, especially if you're busy, but you can even try doing simple things such as changing the language of your operating system, playing games, watching YouTube or other forms of media in your target language. In a way, getting input is just another form of doing reviews to solidify the concepts you're learning as well as potentially pick up new ones. And of course, if you want to reach very high levels of proficiency, spending thousands of hours with the language is probably the most important thing you can do. I am absolutely certain that if I had applied these principles back when I was learning Russian, instead of becoming something like B1 or B2 level, I would have been fluent by now. In fact, fluent way earlier than in 6 years. I'm honestly really curious to see how much easier my life would have been if I had this knowledge back then. What I'd really love to see would be if someone stuck in a similar situation tried these methods out, and over time reported back in the comments telling us how it went. And at what level are you compared to your classmates? Well, those were some thoughts I had on my past experiences of learning Russian, as well as some general thoughts on language classes. I wonder if any of you have had similar experiences, or are in a similar situation yourself right now. Let us know in the comments. That's all for now. Thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, please let me know by, liking the video, and if you'd like to see more, make sure to subscribe. See you next time.